Thanks, Jens, and I wanted to say a special thank you to Eric and Pat for letting me jump. I have the classic Zoom conference disease where I told my wife I would be someplace about an hour after my talk, and if I'm not there, I'm in big trouble. So I greatly appreciate being bumped up a few places. And for the record, it's very easy to get me to Seattle any month other than July and August. Getting me out of Madison in July and August is tough to do. Anyway, I'm going to reflect on some of the same things that Michael were talking. It sounds like a boy band. We're talking about and try to add a bit of perspective to it going forward. The only disclosure I have is nidus, which I think half the room there is part of as well. Can you guys hear me okay? I see you. Can you hear me okay, Jens?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay, very good. Okay. So my assignment was to talk about the assessment of patients with spinal cord injury, the imaging of patients with spinal cord injury, then the acute medical and surgical management of patients with spinal cord injury. I think the first lesson, I think Mike Steinmetz touched on this, is these are trauma patients, and we can't forget our ABCs in these patients. We know that hypotension and hypoxia are going to worsen outcomes, and so we need to prevent these complications from happening. We need to account for associated injuries, and we can't operate on unstable patients. You can't burn the house down taking someone with a spinal cord injury to the operating room if they're bleeding out into their liver. And just as an example, this is a patient that I took care of about 3 weeks ago. He's a 72-year-old man who tripped over his dog. He obviously has DISH and has this fracture dislocation at T3, T4. He was intact when the EMTs found him. By the time the EMTs got him to an outside emergency room, he was paraplegic. They rolled him on his side, and his legs came back. They transferred him up to us, and we were ready to take him to the operating room immediately for this grossly unstable fracture. But it turned out that he had a hemopneumothorax, and when they put the chest tube in, he went through 7 liters in less than half an hour. So this guy could not have immediate early surgery for this unstable injury. He went to the angio suite and had the intercostals embolized. I'll show you what that looks like here. You can see the embolization particles here. While he was in the angio suite, he lost function in his legs because they had him positioned supine. We got him to the operating room. We moved him first lateral and then positioned him with monitoring. He got strength back. We got MEPs back, and we did a relatively standard fixation procedure, and he ended up doing just fine. But it took us 14 hours from the time he hit the door to the time we had him stabilized in the operating room. So there are practical considerations. You can't always do ultra early surgery, and this is something that Mike was talking about as well. After the ABCs, you're going to do your secondary survey to assess for disability. You're going to note gross motor and sensory deficits. You're going to assess for sacral sparing because that's an important key in terms of ASIA E versus D. And you're going to employ the ASIA classification as ABLE. This can be tricky in the acute situation, mainly because the ASIA scale is made for assessment in a post-resuscitation patient. If you are trying to do ultra-early surgery and you're trying to get a detailed ASIA assessment in the trauma bay in the heat of the moment, it is difficult to get a accurate, it can be difficult to get an accurate measure, and you tend to overestimate injury during these things. It's ideally done post-resuscitation, anywhere between 4 and 72 hours after injury. Now, when you look at those 4 and 72 hours, and you look at the definitions of early and ultra-early surgery, you are including a very broad range of time points. And that in and of itself introduces difficulty in terms of interpreting changes in ASIA score when you're looking at patients who have their ASIA scores obtained in the first few hours after surgery as opposed to someone who's having their ASIA score assessed 3 days after surgery. That's a different patient population. This is the ASIA tool. It's been shown before. Basically, there are 2 main parts to it. One is this score sheet where you go through the different sensory dermatomes and motor myotomes, and you'll be able to develop left and right upper extremity and left and right lower extremity scores for a total ASIA score. And this is very useful for research purposes, but doesn't really help you so much in the trauma bay. What we use in the trauma bay, as you do too, is the ASIA A through E a scoring system. A is complete, B is sensory incomplete, so you've got some sacral sparing or maybe some sensation, some caudal dermatomes. C is motor incomplete, where less than half of the muscles below the level of injury have 3 out of 5 strength or better. D is motor incomplete, where you have half the groups have 3 out of 5 strength or better, and E is normal. And this is what we use when we talk to each other and when we are communicating clinically. Sorry about this. The next step after you've assessed the patient is imaging, and CT is the first line and will guide treatment. There's multiple sources of level one evidence saying that CT is better in terms of at least plain films for sensitivity, specificity, negative and positive predictive values, and this is documented in the cervical spine injury guidelines going back to 2000, the first version of these. You can see a lot on CT scan. This is a patient who I took care of about 10 days ago. He's a 63-year-old man who fell in his recovery room, fell in his hospital room, and he was basically a C4 quad. He had no function below his neck, no sensation below the collar. You can see on the CT scan this disc herniation here, and they initially thought that he was having a stroke. So they did a CTA, and you can actually see the acute disc herniation with the acute vascular tissue around it on this axial image here. So you can see a lot of stuff with CT scan. This fellow was in our ICU for about 10 days. He did not improve and requested that he be taken off the ventilator and died a day or so later. In terms of MRI scans, if you want one, that's fine. If you don't need one, don't get one. It certainly can be helpful in the thoracolumbar spine. If you're looking at TLX grading, you're trying to have some documentation of injury to the posterior ligamentous complex. Problem I have with it is you often see some ligamentous changes. I'm not always sure what to make of it. It does occasionally show unexpected pathology, an epidural hematoma or disc space disruption that you weren't expecting. But it rarely, if ever, affects the acute management of a real spinal cord injury. And I'll just show an example. This is a lady who came in. She had a jump facets and a fracture at C6-7. She was neurologically intact. She got to us via another emergency room at the outside emergency room that got an MRI scan, which shows here we did the same operation we would have done without the MRI scan. I would posit that this MRI scan probably didn't add much to her treatment, and there's a risk of getting an MRI scan. Every time you transfer a patient on and off a stretcher, every time you're taking someone out of a really well-supervised area, there's a risk of deterioration, and the risk of neurological deterioration in the hospital in patients with unstable fractures is somewhere between 3 and 8%, depending upon which paper you read. That's not a trivial number. That's 1 out of every 10 or 20 patients is going to have a deterioration in the hospital based upon transportation and poor mobilization. And if you can avoid transportation that you don't necessarily need, perhaps you don't want to do it. These injuries I tend to do from the front. We try to reduce them first, if possible. In terms of the dreaded ventral disc herniation, it's been looked at pretty well. Probably the best paper was the Vaccaro paper from Jefferson a number of years ago, where they found that if you MRI scan every patient before reduction, about half of them will have traumatic disc herniations. And if you MRI scan every patient after reduction, about half of them will have traumatic disc herniations. But that the patients are not the same patients, and it has no influence on functional outcomes. So the importance of seeing that disc herniation is arguable. And if you're going from the front, as I generally do, it's almost a moot point, because you're going to see the dura anyway when you're doing this operation. If there is a disc herniation there, it'll be taken care of. And the guidelines again give it's sort of a, if you want to get an MRI scan, fine, but it is certainly not necessary in the management of most patients. So now we've assessed our patient, we've imaged our patient. What is our role now? Our role is to decompress the spinal cord and stabilize the spine and to prevent secondary injury. The best way to prevent secondary injury is to decompress and stabilize the spine. That's going to prevent further mechanical injury to the spine, and it's going to allow better perfusion of the spinal cord. You can augment this by avoiding hypotension and hypoxia. And that's probably the most important lesson of all the discussion about MAP management, all the discussion of ICU management, is really avoiding hypotension and hypoxia. We know in head injury, going back to the traumatic coma data bank from the 1990s, that the number one predictive, the number one modifiable factors predicting poor outcomes are the presence of hypotension or hypoxia. The same thing in the spinal cord. These things will exacerbate the spinal cord, the secondary injury cascades, and cause. So that is what our job is: decompress, stabilize, avoid hypotension and hypoxia. The type and location of injury will dictate the approach. Both Mikes and I both showed a facet subluxation injury. Eric's going to give a whole talk on burst fractures. I showed a fracture dislocation earlier, and just to complete the triad, I'll show a craniocervical junction case. This is an interesting case of a girl who was thrown from her car after a motor vehicle accident. And for the orthopedic surgeons in the room, this is a C0 injury. She's got a fracture through the clivus and through both occipital condyles, which essentially disassociated her skull with her craniocervical junction. I'd never seen this injury before. I had to do a literature search in the middle of the night, and there were only 3 cases of people who had survived this injury. 2 of them were treated with a halo and subsequently died. And 1 was treated with an occipital cervical fusion and had a rocky course, but eventually survived. This girl was intact, with the exception of some shoulder shrug issues related to her spinal accessory nerve. We ended up just doing a occipital cervical fixation, and then 6 months later took it out, and she now has actually normal functions. So this was just a sort of a neato C0 case to show about the craniocervical junction. This is a diagram similar to what Mike showed, the first Mike showed in his talk, showing all the different pathways that are involved in secondary spinal cord injury. And if you take every single intervention that's been proposed for trying to provide neuroprotection and ameliorate secondary spinal cord injury, their target is on this slide. So I was looking for many years at arachidonic acid metabolism. GM1 ganglioside is a membrane stabilizer preventing lipid peroxidation and membrane breakdown. This is where riluzole works right here. And so the idea was that by steroids hits all of these things. Steroids are the shotgun approach here. The idea is by trying to interrupt some of these negative feedback loops, you can prevent worsening of the initial injury. Unfortunately, nothing's really worked all that well. I know Mike says he would still use steroids and riluzole. That's fine if you want to do it, but there's really not a lot of evidence that's going to make much of a difference. This is that same information in text form for those of you who are recording. The MAP goals are probably a bit overstated. As Mike Steinmetz was saying, there are consequences to everything we do, and trying to get a MAP of 85 for a week in an older, sicker patient can be problematic, and you can run into two issues. I've had a patient in the last 6 months get very sick and almost die from consequences of aggressive MAP treatments in a patient who had a bad heart and problematic fluid status. More recent research suggests that a more modest support for shorter periods of time may be just as good. MAPs push to 70 to 75 as opposed to 85. And we also have to remember that if you have a blood pressure of 120 over 70, which doesn't seem all that high, that's a MAP of 87. So we're not trying to make these people hypertensive. What we really want to focus on is preventing hypotension and hypoxia at the same time. Although there's not a lot of research in hypoxia as there is in head injury. There's not as much in spinal cord injury. In terms of when to go, earlier is better when practical. To be honest, I'm much more anxious to get an unstable intact or unstable partial patient to the operating room as soon as possible as opposed to the complete injury. Preventing a worsened injury is an easy way to improve your post-op ASIA scales. If you can prevent someone going from a B to a D and they come out as a B, that's great. They've already made their 2-point improvement. So that is job one. Prevent in-hospital deterioration and stabilize them as soon as you can. I think about this when I'm deciding whether or not to get an MRI scan, for example. Is that MRI scan going to give me enough information to warrant the extra 2 transfers and having the patient off the unit with a nurse who may or may not be familiar with spinal cord injury patients? The stasis study that Michael talked clearly showed that studying this patient population is difficult. Mike has employed fancy statistics and has found signals in different patient populations. When I hear these words, I think of the Mark Twain quote, which he ascribes to Benjamin Disraeli of lies, damn lies, and statistics. If your primary analysis is false, you can go looking for things all you want, but it's not going to hold a lot of water. And this is the stasis study, and their conclusion, which Mike shared with us, was that decompression prior to 24 hours after spinal cord injury can be performed safely, which I agree with completely, in appropriate patients, and is associated with improved neurological outcome. And I also agree that it is associated with improved neurological outcome, defined as at least a 2-grade improvement in 6 months follow-up. However, if you actually look at and this is the slide that shows that result, but if you look at the demographics, it turns out that it is twice as likely that you are able to have a 2-point improvement if you were in the early group as opposed to the late group. So 55% of the patients in the early group could have had a 2-point improvement, whereas only less than 30% of the patients in the early group could have had a 2-point improvement. So it's there's some math happening here, and it's important to know math when you're making decisions. So I like to go early. From a practical standpoint, if I go early, it doesn't screw up the next day. I'm happy to go in the middle of the night if I can justify it. If the patient's sick, or if it's going to be a complex case that I don't want to have the C team with, it's okay to wait until the patient is stabilized and you have the appropriate people to help. So in conclusion, our job is to thoroughly assess the patient with regard to level and severity of injury after we've performed a thorough assessment of hemodynamic stability and associated injuries. CT scan is the basis of trauma imaging. If you want an MRI scan, go ahead. If you think it is worth the risks of transport. If you don't want an MRI scan, that's fine too. It makes sense to operate as soon as it is safe to in patients with spinal cord injury. In potentially vulnerable patients, it is definitely critical to get the spinal cord decompressed and stabilized as soon as possible. And these are the incomplete or intact patients who have the scary fractures. They're the ones that really get my heart rate up. The data in complete patients is much less compelling, but most of us still try to get this done promptly. While this may not be done based on hugely convincing scientific evidence, it is something we believe, and sometimes it's okay to act based on belief as long as you understand that the basis of your belief may be flawed. So if she weighs the same as a duck, maybe she is a witch. I can't say either way. So thank you very much for your attention. I'll be happy to stick around for a few minutes to take questions, but I can't stay for too long, otherwise I'll be castrated.
All right. Don't want the urologic procedure to fall. Thank you, Dan. Outstanding. Love the pragmatic approach in the case presentations. And again, so much of what we're seeing nowadays does not fit in the textbooks anymore because it's just outrageous comorbidities and very difficult circumstances. One of my biggest fears are these aging patients who have had an initial screening CT, let's say. There's no really concrete neurology. There's a lot of spinalotic stuff around, and then they're quadriplegic, tetraplegic, or paraplegic a little bit later in the hospital frequently because they had an unrecognized hyperextension fracture somewhere, just similar to that case that you showed. Mm-hmm. Any tips, any tricks in this very polymorbid population to kind of try to avoid these secondary deteriorations? You hinted at that in your talk also.
Yeah, it's key. I have a horrible case of a fellow who was treated in an outside hospital and sent to a nursing home. He had a fracture dislocation at extension injury in a disc guy at C7T1, which they didn't see on the films, and he paralyzed himself in rehab while they were working on him because it was just missed. And this problem is getting worse. I don't know. I'm sure it's the same there as it is here, but we have all of the surrounding hospital systems around us have gone away. From the Affordable Care Act to COVID, there are no qualified spine surgeons, no qualified intensivists anywhere outside our facility for Chicago to Mayo, and we are full all the time. And so we have all these doc-in-a-boxes that are manned by PAs or hospitalists who have no idea of what's going on, and we get these calls, and we'll get a study which may or may not be complete, may or may not be helpful, and you're trying to give them advice, but what they need to do is they need to send the patients up here now, but they can't, and so we've had several patients deteriorate before getting to us, and I feel bad. These are PAs who are by themselves who are just trying to get their patients someplace, and they can't for days, and the patients deteriorate. It's a terrible problem. But minimizing transport. If you don't need the MRI scan, don't get the MRI scan. If you don't need to, do whatever, don't do it. Just get them to the OR. And positioning these patients is the scariest part of the whole thing. I virtually never use monitoring except for these cases, and I use it for positioning. That's pre and post positioning. Once that's done, my blood pressure drops. Now I can do the operation. But it is a problem, and you mitigate it the best you can.
Great stuff. We don't want to get injured. Thank you. Thank you. Great lecture, and thank her for the overtime.
I'm on the phone right now, so very good. Thank you. Take care.
Get going.